in this module of the medicine interview course, we're going to talk about virtual interviews, online interviews, and how we're going to adapt to the medical school interviews when they're delivered in an online format. Obviously, at the moment, the world has had to completely reshift the way they think about things and has had to do a lot of their business online, and medical school is no different. And because of that, how we adapt and how we deliver the interview is going to change massively. So there's going to be a few things that change with the panel and the MMI interviews. And the panel will be very similar to normal face-to-face, but obviously we're going to have to make considerations as to how we adapt to the tech and the online format. The MMI interviews are actually going to be slightly different. Some universities have said that they're going to change to panel interviews, whereas some have decided that they are actually going to stick to the MMI format. So what's going to happen is, whereas in real life you would rotate around and go to a different station one by one by moving yourself, you're going to stay in one place, of course, whilst the interviews actually rotate around you. So the stations will come to you and you will stay in the same place. So what this module is going to do is serve as a crash course in amateur cinematography, production, and basically it's a lesson and exercise in what could possibly go wrong, how do we counter for any situations that could occur, how do we best prepare for them, and most importantly, how do we adapt our interview style to perform well on the online virtual medical school interviews. So the module is going to be divided into 6 sections. The first being the location that you choose. Then we're going to look at the lighting. Then we're going to look at how to change your body language in accordance with the online format. We're going to look at adapting your style to perform better in these online interviews for med school. Then we're going to look at the technical equipment and how to optimize that so that your interview runs smoothly. And finally, we'll look at all the things that could go wrong and how we can prevent them and then deal with them if they were to actually occur. So before we dive into the individual sections, I just want to run over a few small points with you. The first being is that these online interview formats are not actually all that new. Universities often interview international students and don't make them fly all the way out just to deliver their interview. So they actually have been doing these formats online for quite some time. So it's not a completely new thing, it's just obviously the scale that they're not used to. So rest assured that this isn't completely novel, and universities are used to and practiced in delivering interviews in this sort of format. The other thing that I really need you to understand is that despite the format being online, the content and the level of difficulty of these interviews is going to be absolutely the same as if you're delivering face-to-face. Okay, so I don't want you to think that just because they're in the comfort of what will probably be your own home, that you should prepare any less or that they're somehow going to be easier. Just please don't fall into that trap. So let's look at our first aspect, which is the location that you're going to choose. This is most probably going to be your own home, and we're going to pick a room in the house that is best suited to you performing well at interview. The universities will actually give you some criteria as to what constitutes an acceptable location to have your online interview in. But other than that, it's completely up to you, which is great because that gives us an element of control over how the interview is going to go. You can control the environment, you can put it in a place that's most optimal for you to feel comfortable, for you to have good internet connection, and for you to feel at ease and relaxed enough for you to deliver your best answers. So what are the considerations that we need to bear in mind when we select our room? Firstly, you need to remember that the room that you choose and the background is also going to give an impression about you. Whether it's subconscious or not, the setting that you're in is going to contribute to that overall first impression that you give. So when we're choosing a room, let's choose one with a nice, adequate background that's neutral and not too stand out, with nothing off-putting in the background. For example, here I have a white wall behind me, and maybe the little money tree might be posing as some small distraction, but it shouldn't really be taking away too much from what's going on in the center of the screen. Silly things like making sure that the room that you choose is tidy, because obviously if you saw somebody and on a professional Zoom call and their room was really messy, it would, for better or worse, lead to you making an impression about that person. Two of the really important considerations about the room that you choose are the proximity to the Wi-Fi and the disruptions that that room could potentially face. Now, with the Wi-Fi, you want to pick somewhere that obviously has the best signal possible. But if you find a room that is otherwise perfectly suitable, has great lighting and all the other things that will come on to describe being important, but the only problem is that the Wi-Fi connection is not very good, you can always get a signal booster. And I've linked to a really great and cheap signal booster that you can use that has worked perfectly for me and has all really good reviews. So with minimizing disruptions, it's really important that we get the entire family and the whole household on board. They need to be made aware that this is a really important big occasion for you, and that they need to do as much as possible to minimize their impact on your interview. So when you select the room, you might need to choose somewhere that's, for example, away from the kitchen or away from the rest of where your family will be at that particular time. And we need to do everything with our environment to minimize disruptions. So that means you're going to have to turn your phone off. You're going to have to maybe take the house phone off the hook. For example, I live in a flat and I can mute my buzzer, so you might want to take the flat buzzer off the hook as well. Turning notifications off on your laptop is going to be really important as well. I'm sure you've listened to a podcast episode where clearly one of the guests has forgotten to turn off their notifications on their laptop, and how disruptive it is if it's dinging every 5 minutes. It's not only disruptive for the person at the other end of the call, but it's disruptive for you, and it's going to put you off delivering the answers in the best possible way that you can. And as I said, this is going to be an exercise in unturning every possible stone that could cause disruptions to your interview. So we're thinking of absolutely everything. That means that even things like making sure there are no deliveries scheduled for that time, that day and that particular time slot isn't the time when somebody arranges for the Tesco big shop to be delivered. Everything that you can think of to make the process run as smoothly as possible and to just minimize any of those potential interruptions. So the next element we need to think about is the lighting of the location that you choose. The best is always to use natural lighting. So if you can, pick somewhere with where you're close to a window and the incident light is coming in on your face. You don't want it the other way around, where there's a big window behind you and light coming in, so that it gives that Jesus light effect and your face is in the shadow. Because the balance is about not being too overexposed, so you're really, really harsh and white, but at the same time, your face doesn't want to be underexposed and too in the shadow, so that they can tell the expressions that you're making to give the overall impression of how you're interviewing. You might have chosen a great room, but it turns out at the time of day that you're going to interview, the sun might be shining in, causing a glare, which completely ruins it and makes it unusable. So, this, like I say, this is an exercise in preparing for that. So it might mean that you have to reconsider the room, or just simple things like making sure that there's a blind or using even a bed sheet to cover up the glare. Bear in mind that these interviews are usually carried out in winter, so you might be having a 4 or half 4 interview, and by that time the sun might have gone down. So you might need to consider alternative sources of lighting. So behind the camera, you may want to put a lamp, or even, if you have something like a ring light, that works really well, so that the light is behind the camera, but shining on your face, so the light bounces off your face onto the camera. And then, like I say, when we're considering absolutely every variable that we need to think about, if you're wearing glasses, just be wary of where the light's shining, so that the light doesn't bounce off your glasses onto the lens, and again, make the shot overexposed or too glary for the person on the other side. And the final thing on that front to consider is also the level of where the webcam is in relation to your eyes. You want the webcam, as you can see I'm recording now, the camera, the lens of the camera should be directly at eye level, and that creates the best image. Now, that may mean that you need to invest in a laptop stand or something as simple as getting a cardboard box to put the laptop on. The third thing we're going to consider for adapting to the virtual medicine interviews is our body language. Now, as I've said in previous videos, 80% of communication is non-verbal, and I've talked through exactly what constitutes positive body language versus some of the body language postures that you want to avoid during interview. However, we need to consider how we're going to adapt to these online interviews, and a lot of that is going to do with framing. It's important to set up your camera at a distance that allows the camera to show enough of your body so that you are able to actually demonstrate the positive body language that you're using. And that all comes down to the framing. So as you can see in this shot, I'm probably maybe even slightly closer than you'd like to be for your online interview. But what you want to do is allow a little bit of space at the top of your head, so there's a bit of breathing room between. And then you want to go down to somewhere between maybe the belly button and the nipple, somewhere in between that. And that way you can see when people are using their arms, you can see the way they're sitting, and you can essentially put across the positive body language that you're using. Just to refresh, body language needs to be sat upright, just slightly past 90 degrees, and hands on your laps, leaning forward and being well engaged. And if you want to have a look at the other videos on body language and some of the postures to avoid, you can do that and go back to those videos. Number 4 is that we need to look at how we're going to adapt our style to these online medicine interview formats. The first thing to bear in mind is that even with good internet connection, there is sometimes a lag on Zoom calls and Microsoft Teams, whatever you use. So the important thing is not to move around too much, because if there's a lag, it creates shadows and blurring, and that's really distracting for the people on the other side. The same way with the lag is there's sometimes a bit of a delay in the back and forth between you and the interviewer. So that means when they're speaking, you want to give a moment just for them to finish their answer. So let them finish, make sure there's nobody else that wants to add anything, and have a brief pause before you start answering your question. That also works the other way. When you're finished, you want to allow them to know that you have finished your answer. So deliver your answer, and then something like a nod and a smile just to show that you're finished. So you'll answer your question like this, and then to show you that you finished, you go. And that allows them time to realize that you finished and then go on to their next question. An important element that goes alongside body language when you're interviewing is your eye contact. Now, obviously, you're not going to be in the room to deliver eye contact, or to, when you've got a panel, go in turn to everybody and look at each member of the panel to make good eye contact with them. So you're going to have to make your eye contact through the webcam. Now, the best way to deliver good eye contact on an online format is to look directly down the barrel of the lens. Now, whenever you're talking and giving an answer, I want you to consistently look at the lens. And whilst you're talking and looking down the barrel of the lens to make eye contact with them, you can occasionally look down at the screen just to gauge reactions. But I want you to maintain the majority of your focus looking directly down the barrel. And that's something that you're going to have to practice, because it's a skill that, and some habit breaking, because most of us, when we're on a Zoom call, typically look at the screen. So something that you're going to have to go away and practice. So what do we do when they're talking? Well, I would say you still want to look down the barrel of the lens so that you feel like you're making eye contact with them. But for this, it's okay to look at the screen a bit more, because obviously you need to be focused on what they're saying and understand that. So that's your main priority. But in that sense, when they're talking, you're able to look a bit more at the screen than you would when you're talking yourself. So one good trick that you can do to remind you to look down the barrel of the lens is to put a post-it note or even a picture of someone that you're comfortable talking to right next to the lens. So that reminds you to keep looking into that as you're delivering the interview. The other thing to bear in mind when somebody else is talking is that if you would demonstrate active listening like you normally would in an interview, saying things like yes and umming along to show signs of agreement, you will interrupt the audio between the two parties. So really it's important to show that you're active listening still, but just do that non-verbally. So essentially that means nodding and smiling to show that you're paying attention to their answer. One of the elements that's really important when adapting to camera is to know the platform that you're going to be using really well. So ahead of time, the university should tell you what platform you're going to be using. Again, it could be Zoom, Google Hangouts, Microsoft Teams, lots of different platforms available. But it's important that you do a trial run. Now, I'll talk more about a trial run later in the video, but it's so important for many factors, for the setting, how it looks, practicing your interview technique on screen, getting the right room, checking that you've got the right internet connection speed. But also, it's important that you actually have a look at the usability of that platform. So what I want you to do is play with every single button on that platform that you're going to be using ahead of time, because you might, for example, click on a button that sends you that opens a window or lets you no longer be able to see yourself, or doesn't let you see the other party. And it's really important that you've had a play with this so that you can get out of it when you're under pressure. So if you know how to use the platform ahead of time, it's not going to put you off when you accidentally click on something and you know how to get out of it. And that brings me on to glitches. If you have any glitches whatsoever with the running of your interview, with the platform, or your ability to hear or speak, just tell them, because it's not going to be obvious to them that you're being distracted by something that's not working properly. And it will probably result in them judging your answer as if you are unhindered. So it's really important to say, look, I can't hear you, or I'm really struggling with so-and-so. And it's a sign of maturity to say, like, look, can we just stop a second, because I'm really struggling with the platform at the moment. I can't hear you, or whatever it is that's hindering you. Because that is much better than struggling through and delivering a subpar answer, which will reduce the impression and reduce the marks that you get from the answer that you deliver. And the final part of knowing the platform is also think about how it starts. I know that people should ignore this, but there's first impressions are really, really important. And actually, when I do calls with students, the amount of times that the video starts and they're just there, kind of not engaged. Sometimes I even see people picking their nose. People don't realize the start of the video, what exactly, as soon as it loads, that they can be seen, I can see what they're doing, and that will be exactly the same. So make sure from the moment that you open up the application that you're smiling and that you're on. Don't wait for the first hello and the can you hear me sort of start for you to really engage with them. And that's another element of camera-specific body language that we need to think about, because it's very tempting to sit there with your elbows on the desk, hands like this in front of your face. Just make sure you're not doing any strange habits. And this is a good thing about doing live video where you'll be able to see yourself, is that you'll be able to see some of maybe the subconscious habits that in person you wouldn't have noticed. But a common one on online video interviews is people put their hands in front of their face, they rest their hands like this, all these sorts of things, like they fiddle. I always fiddle with my beard, which I've stopped doing. These are all the kind of things that you need to think about and eliminate, and luckily you'll be able to see as you're doing them, but just be mindful of those. And the final part of adapting to camera is dress code. Now, obviously we say wear neutral clothes anyway, don't wear anything too outlandish or too garish. Now this is even more important on screen, because on Zoom calls, for one reason or another, it picks up louder colours much more, and they're much more standout and much more off-putting. So more than ever, it's a good reminder to wear neutral clothes, have a neutral background, and just wear things that are very conservative. And as I've said previously, a sober look is very important when you're interviewing for medicine. So the fifth part of this that we need to consider is all the technical considerations. Now, I've talked about it before, but these are things like making sure you have the camera at the right height. Again, eye level is the most important. Then you need to ensure that you have good audio quality. That's both when talking, so the other person receiving your audio, and the audio that you're getting back from the person on the other side. So that includes as well checking that there's any echoes in the room or any weird sounds that are coming, such as buzzings that you may not have realized when you're in the room yourself normally. And it's potentially worth considering trying it with headphones and a microphone so that the audio that you deliver is a lot clearer and your picking up of their audio on their side is less hindered. And I've linked to some suggestions for some really good audio equipment that you can use, such as a very cheap microphone and some good headphones that you can use. If possible, for your medicine online interviews, I would recommend that you use a laptop. Now, the reason for that being that there's a high chance that, like in the UCAT and BMAT home exams, they may ask you to take your camera and pan it around the room just to make sure there's nothing in there that's allowing you to cheat. So if you had a desktop, it's going to be very difficult with that. But also the reason for using a laptop, I would say, is it's a lot more stable than a phone. I would really not recommend using a phone at all, to be honest. And that's because things like having a small screen doesn't help with the usability of it. And unless you have a tripod, definitely don't hold it because it'll be wobbly and just look really, really unprofessional and not really help with you delivering good body language and just concentrating on what you need to, which is delivering your answers for the interview. So that brings me on to one of the most important action steps that you need to do to prepare for this interview, which is to do a trial run. Now, it's so important that you need to practice with the device that you're going to use. You need to use the platform that you're going to use. You need to do it at the same time of day that you're having your interview, and also in the same room that you're going to do it in. So do the trial run with either a family member or someone who's also interviewing, so that you can actually not just do the check of all the equipment, but actually do a mock interview with them to have a go answering some questions. It will get you used to answering those types of questions in that sort of environment. On the day, you're going to have to do absolutely everything you can to ensure that you maximize your internet speed. Now, the providers recommend that you need at least 1 megabyte per second of internet bandwidth to ensure that you can support online video. So you need to do everything on the day to ensure that you can provide the best bandwidth for your internet speed. So that means things like making sure other people in the family aren't downloading things or streaming things at the time, making sure that all the devices that aren't necessary at the time are disconnected from the internet, and doing whatever you can to make sure that that speed isn't hindered. And the final technical point to consider is that you need to make sure that all the devices that you're going to be using on the day of your online interview are charged. Now, obviously we'll have them plugged into the wall, and that's another part of it as well. You need to make sure that everything that you're going to be using is plugged in, but also make sure that it's charged ahead of time. So for example, if in a nervous state you forget to plug your laptop into the wall, if it's got full battery, then the chances are that it will survive the length of the interview and you won't be hindered. So these are all these little stones that we're unturning just to make sure that we're covering for every eventuality as much as we can for the big day. So for the final part of this how to adapt to the virtual medical school interviews, let's look at the most feared thing, which is the common issues and common problems that might occur during the interview. So the first one is that somebody interrupts you somehow, whether they walk into the room, or the common thing that we get is people that have young children in the family, for example, and they storm into the room and disrupt the interview. Now, how you handle that will really impact how the interview goes. It's obviously something that can be avoided. So by talking to the family ahead of time, making sure that the young children are not in a position where they can just storm into the room, and also telling other family members and making them aware that, it's an important hour or plus, and you need to make sure that they don't disrupt you. But if the worst does happen, well, just get the person out of the room as soon as possible. If it's a young child, or even if it's an adult, you can usually kind of charmingly say, oh gosh, they never listen, or something like that. And just deal with it as quickly as possible, and then get the disruption out of the way and carry on with the interview, and try your best not to let it faze you. The second most common dreaded mishap is connectivity issues. If your internet connection is starting to flounder, of course, first just try and reconnect. But if that's not happening, I want you to have a couple of backup options prepared, okay? So the first one I would say is another computer or another laptop, or where you can connect like that. And also have other methods with which you can connect. So for example, suggest to them that you might be able to use FaceTime, or another form of video calling. Secondly, you can use your phone. So if you're going to have your phone as a backup, I would recommend that you invest in a cheap tripod that you can mount the phone on, so that you don't have to hold it, and that the picture will be steady. Now, I've linked to a cheap tripod that I recommend that's really good. And finally, the ultimate backup option you need to do is get a number for the university that you can call if your internet connection is lost altogether. Because at least that way that they know that you are trying to get on and you're just having difficulty, and they can either slot you in a bit later in the day, or ultimately, if they have to, they will have to just reschedule the entire interview. Now, I predict that this is going to be a common occurrence with interviews being disrupted in one way or another. And to be honest, it may very well be a bit of a nightmare for universities this year. So it's nothing to get stressed out about, but it is something to prepare for as much as you can, and do everything within your power to prepare yourself so that you're not one of these people that this happens to. But at the same time, rest assured that a connectivity problem isn't going to stop you getting into medical school, and universities aren't going to not allow you to resit your interview based on a connectivity problem. The final common issue is background noise. Now, I live in London, for example, where all the time there are loud sirens going past my window and causing disruptions. Now, if it's a small, short disruption like that, obviously just wait for a second, pause while the siren's going past, or whatever the loud noise may be, and then you can apologize. There's no real need to apologize, but then say, oh, sorry, and then just continue as you were. But don't try and talk over the loud noise. Now, what if it's something a bit more persistent than that? Say, for example, you could have never known that there were some roadworks about to start the day of your interview, and they're just constant and loud and don't let you perform an interview. Well, I would suggest two things. Firstly, as well as we've got plan B methods to perform your interview on, have a plan B room. If it's the other side of the house or the apartment and there's less disruption from the street noise that's there, then great, you could use that. But ultimately, you can just say to the interviewers, look, I'm really sorry, there's some roadworks that have just come up today. I didn't realize that they were going to be here. Can we please reschedule for a time or another day where those disturbances won't be there? And universities will be very understanding of this. Fantastic. So that brings us to the end of this module on virtual medical school interviews. To quickly finish, I'm going to summarize and give some additional tips and tricks to make sure that you perform well on your med school interview day when you're delivering it online. So the first thing is just to remember that the content is going to be exactly the same as it is for normal in-person med school interviews. So prepare and revise exactly the same as you would. And just remember to just adapt the style so that it's friendly to the virtual interview format. Remember not to fall into the trap of thinking that it's going to be any easier when you're doing it online in the comfort of what will probably be your own home. It's still going to be just as hard, so you still need to prepare just as much as you would if you were doing a face-to-face interview. Remember to choose a location that has good internet connection in your house, is well lit, and is as disruption-free as possible. Remember, when you're speaking on these online medicine interviews, to slow down when you speak, articulate, make sure you speak very clearly, and remember to use pauses after someone's spoken, to nod and smile at the end of your answer, and remember to make sure when it's your turn to listen, to demonstrate active listening by nodding instead of using verbal cues that might disrupt the audio feed. Other tips are for if you're an international student, to make sure that you know the time difference. You can use the world clock on your phone to make sure that you get the correct time and account for any time differences between the countries. A really important thing is to check your tech. So make sure all the audio equipment's working, the camera's working, you have the right internet speed connection. You need to do things like, for example, close down any apps that are going to be disturbing on your phone or consuming data. Get people around the house, if they're streaming or doing anything that's consuming a lot of data, make sure that they stop them for the big day. Also, things like checking notifications aren't active on your laptop and disrupting you whilst you're delivering answers. So with that, we need to check all these things in a trial run. So it's important to find a friend, or even just find a family member. There can even be somebody in the other room, just to run through everything, but also not just to do a trial run, to actually practice in this online format. Because as I say, the material is going to be the same, but the way that you deliver it is going to be slightly different. So as much as you practice, you can get used to delivering that same content, those same answers, but in an online format. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this module on adapting to the online medical school interviews. In the next modules, we're going to be looking at the more hardcore subjects, which are more knowledge specific. And with that, we're going to be looking at specific practice questions, mock interview questions, and I'll take you through some model answers and some scenarios and how to answer them best. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next module.